The first time Theodora Aldridge set foot in Calico Crossing, she told herself she would not stay a single day longer than necessary. And that was the same lie she had been telling herself for the better part of 3 months. It was the autumn of 1882, and the town of Calico Crossing sat like a stubborn old mule in the middle of the Nevada desert, too proud to move and too weathered to shine. The main street was a long strip of packed dirt flanked by a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Dusty Spur, a small church with a crooked steeple, a doctor's office, and a handful of other establishments that seemed to lean against each other for support the way tired men lean on fence posts. The surrounding land was flat and wide, broken up by distant red mesas and stretches of scrub brush, and the sky above it all was enormous, the kind of sky that makes a person feel very small and very honest at the same time. Theodora had come to Calico Crossing by stagecoach after a sequence of events that she did not enjoy recounting. Her father had died in Sacramento in the early part of 1882, leaving behind debts she had not known existed and a boarding house that belonged, it turned out, more to the bank than to any member of the Aldridge family. She had been 24 years old, suddenly alone, and faced with the very practical problem of where to go and how to survive. Her mother had passed when Theodora was 12, and she had no siblings. There was a distant aunt in a town called Millstone, Nevada, which sat a reasonable distance from Calico Crossing, and that aunt had written to say there was a schoolteacher position open in the area. The letter had been brief and not particularly warm, but it was the only letter Theodora had received that year that did not demand money from her, so she packed 2 trunks and boarded the first stage heading east. The schoolteacher position turned out to be in Calico Crossing itself, not in Millstone, and the aunt had neglected to mention that the school was barely a school at all. It was a single room attached to the back of the church, with 12 children of varying ages and a supply of chalk that was nearly exhausted. The previous teacher had left abruptly, and the town council, such as it was, had been desperate enough to accept Theodora based on nothing more than a letter of recommendation from her father's old minister, and the fact that she had completed 2 years of study at a women's institute in Sacramento before money had run out. She told herself she would get through the school term and then move on. She told herself that when the November winds began to scrape along the desert floor. She told herself that again when December brought cold nights and a thin coating of frost on the water trough outside her rented room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patris Hensley. She was still telling herself some version of the same thing when February arrived, and the children in her schoolroom were beginning to read full sentences and do sums with a confidence they had not possessed before, and she found herself caring about that far more than she had expected. The boarding house where she lived was a decent enough place, kept clean by Mrs. Hensley with an almost aggressive dedication to order. There were 4 rooms available for rent, and throughout the winter 2 of those rooms had been occupied by the same 2 men, a traveling surveyor named Mr. Colton, who was quiet and pleasant and almost always smelled of ink, and Abel Walker. Abel Walker was not a man who went unnoticed, though he seemed to prefer it that way. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends when it grew past his collar, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same red sandstone as the mesas beyond town. He had brown eyes that were sharp and observant in the way of a man who has learned to read situations quickly, and he moved with the kind of unhurried deliberateness that spoke not of laziness, but of a person who had long since stopped wasting energy on things that did not require it. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy: canvas trousers, a worn leather vest over a cotton shirt, boots that had covered serious miles, and a hat that had seen every kind of weather, and he was, in fact, exactly that, or had been. When Theodora had first arrived at the boarding house, Mrs. Hensley had introduced Abel Walker as the man who handled the horses and occasional labor for old Mr. Gideon Pratt, whose cattle ranch sat 2 miles east of town. Abel had taken off his hat, nodded to Theodora with a politeness that was genuine rather than performative, and said, "Welcome to Calico Crossing, Miss Aldridge. I hope it treats you well." She had thanked him and thought nothing more of it that evening, because she had been tired from 3 days of stagecoach travel, and her mind had been occupied with the more pressing concern of whether her trunks had survived the journey intact. They had not, entirely. The smaller one had come apart at one hinge, and several of her books had gotten damp. She had spent the first evening drying pages over the lamp in her room and telling herself that things could always be worse. The mornings at the boarding house were the first place she and Abel Walker had begun to exist in the same space with any regularity. Mrs. Hensley served breakfast at 7 o'clock sharp and expected her boarders to be present for it, because she cooked once, and she was not a restaurant. Abel was always there before Theodora, already on his second cup of coffee when she came down, and he had a habit of reading whatever newspaper had made it to town, which was usually several days old by the time it arrived. He would sometimes read a piece aloud if it seemed interesting, not to anyone in particular, just into the air of the dining room, and Theodora had found herself listening before she had consciously decided to. One morning in October, about 2 weeks after she had arrived, she sat down across from him, and he read aloud a brief item about a new railroad expansion, and then said without looking up, "They keep saying the railroad is coming through this part of Nevada. Been saying it for 4 years. Do you think it will?" she asked, because it seemed like the kind of thing a person with an opinion would have an opinion about. He set the paper down and considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "Eventually," he said, "though I think by the time it does, this town will look pretty different. Whether that's better or worse depends on who you ask." "What would you say it is?" she asked. He looked at her then directly, and she noticed for the first time that his eyes had a kind of thoughtfulness in them that she had not expected from a cowboy, though she recognized that expectation as unfair almost immediately after having it. "Both," he said. "Most things that change a place are both." It was not a conversation that would have meant anything to anyone overhearing it, but Theodora found herself thinking about it later that day, standing in front of her 12 students and explaining the difference between a noun and a verb. She thought that Abel Walker was more interesting than she had initially given him credit for, and then she went back to teaching and did not think about it again until the next morning, when he was already at the table with his coffee and his newspaper, and she sat down across from him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. That was how it began, which is to say it began the way most important things do, quietly, without announcement, without either person understanding quite what was starting. The weeks passed the way weeks do in a small town, which is to say both slowly and very quickly, depending on what day it was and what was happening. Theodora settled into the rhythms of the school. She learned which children were quick and which needed more patience, and which ones were both at the same time, which was most of them. She learned that the general store was run by a man named Harold Birch who had opinions about everything and kept particularly fine penny candy in a jar on the counter. She learned that the saloon, the Dusty Spur, was not a place a schoolteacher was expected to go, but that Mrs. Hensley sometimes procured a bottle of decent whiskey and kept it in the kitchen for medicinal purposes and the occasional difficult evening. She learned, without making a particular study of it, quite a lot about Abel Walker. She learned that he had grown up in Texas, somewhere near the hill country, and that he had come west as a young man doing cattle drives along the trails that pushed north, and then spread out in various directions once they crossed into Nevada. She learned that he had worked ranches in 3 states, that he was skilled with horses in the way of a man who genuinely understood them rather than merely managed them. She learned that he could fix almost anything mechanical if given enough time and the right materials, that he was fair in his dealings with people and did not suffer dishonesty quietly, and that he sent a portion of his wages every month to an address in Texas, which she later learned was for his mother and younger sister. She learned most of this the way you learn things about someone you share a breakfast table with and occasionally share a walk home with on evenings when they happen to be heading in the same direction, which, with the boarding house being where it was and the school being where it was, happened more often than pure coincidence would account for. What Theodora did not learn, because it was not the kind of thing Abel Walker said out loud, was the reason he had not left Calico Crossing. She had no reason to think there was such a reason. She knew he had arrived in Calico Crossing the previous spring with the intention, as he had mentioned once in passing, of staying through the summer and then moving on to a position he had been offered at a larger operation in Arizona. It was good work, well paying, and he was qualified for it. Everyone in town seemed to know that Abel Walker was the sort of man who moved, not restlessly, not out of dissatisfaction, but out of the particular freedom that comes to a man who has no fixed obligations to any one place. He had come and he would go. That was simply the shape of him, as far as Calico Crossing was concerned, except that he had not gone. Summer had passed, autumn had come, and Abel Walker was still in Calico Crossing, still rising at dawn to work Gideon Pratt's horses, still appearing at the breakfast table at 7, still reading old newspapers in the evenings on the boarding house porch when the weather allowed it. Theodora assumed, without giving it much thought, that the work at the Pratt Ranch had extended, or that the Arizona position had fallen through, or any of the 100 reasonable explanations that a person might apply to a situation they are not particularly curious about. She was not particularly curious about it because she was busy. She was always busy, and because she had a fundamental instinct, inherited perhaps from her father, to respect the private arrangements of other people's lives. Abel Walker, for his part, was not particularly good at saying things that were difficult to say. He was good at most things. He was good at work and good at listening and good at the kind of steady presence that makes a difficult situation easier without requiring any explanation of why. He was good at knowing when to speak and when not to. He was, in the specific way that men of his type and era often were, deeply unpracticed at saying the things that mattered most to him, because those things felt dangerous in a way that no amount of physical hardship had ever felt dangerous. The truth, which he kept as carefully as a man keeps a thing he is afraid to lose by exposure, was this: he had been preparing to leave in September, when the Arizona offer was still on the table, and the decision was all but made. He had been packing the few things he traveled with, which did not amount to much, and he had been making the quiet internal calculations of a man who is about to move on, writing letters, settling the last of his accounts, telling Gideon Pratt that he would finish out the week, and then he would be gone. And then Theodora Aldridge had arrived on the afternoon stage. He had not been watching for the stage particularly. He happened to be at the livery stable, which was near the stage stop, and he happened to look up when the horses pulled in, and he had seen her step down from the coach with a trunk that was clearly too heavy for her, and a look on her face that was neither helpless nor desperate, but something more like determined and exhausted and quietly hopeful all at once, and something about that combination had stopped him mid-thought the way a sudden sound stops a man mid-step. He had helped with the trunk. She had thanked him. He had gone back to the livery stable, finished what he was doing, and spent the rest of the afternoon trying to convince himself that it had been nothing, that it was simply the act of a decent man helping a woman with a heavy bag, that it meant nothing more than that. He had not written the letter to Arizona. He had told himself he would write it the following morning, and then the morning had come, and he had sat down to breakfast, and Theodora had sat across from him, and said something about the chalk situation in the schoolroom with such exasperated affection for the children she had not yet met that he had actually laughed, which was not something he did as frequently as perhaps he should have, and he had not written the letter. He had not written it the next week either, or the week after that. He had told Gideon Pratt he would stay through the winter, which Gideon had accepted with uncomplicated gratitude because good horsemen were hard to find. He had not told Gideon, or anyone else, the reason, because the reason felt like something that belonged only to him, something he had not earned the right to speak aloud, because speaking it would require knowing what to do with it, and he did not know what to do with it. What he knew was that he woke up every morning and went to the breakfast table and felt something ease in him when he heard her come down the stairs, and that the days when she was particularly animated, about a book she was reading, about something one of the children had done, about a problem she was turning over in her mind, were the best kind of days he had had in a long time. He knew that when she walked beside him in the evenings her shoulder was sometimes almost close enough to brush his, and that he was always very aware of that distance. He knew that she looked at him sometimes with a directness that was not quite looking through a person but was very much looking at a person, and that he found it both the best and the most complicated thing. He did not say any of this. He poured her coffee in the mornings when he was up first, because that was a thing he could do without having to explain himself. He fixed the broken hinge on her smaller trunk one afternoon when she had gone to the school, because Mrs. Hensley mentioned it and because he had the tools and the ability and it took him 20 minutes. He listened when she talked, really listened, in the way that is rarer than it should be and that most people, when they experience it, recognize as a form of care even when they cannot name it precisely. Theodora noticed the coffee. She noticed the trunk. She noticed the listening. She ascribed all of it to him being a thoughtful man, a good man, which he was, and she did not ascribe it to anything more specific than that. November moved into December, and December had a particular quality in the desert that she had not anticipated. The cold was dry and sharp, and the stars at night were extraordinary more stars than she had ever seen over Sacramento, where the fog and the city lights conspired to diminish the sky. She mentioned this to Abel one evening when they were both on the porch after supper, she with a cup of tea and he with his coffee, and he told her that the sky had been one of the things he had first loved about the West, back when he was a young man on his first cattle drive, and had not yet grown accustomed to sleeping under it. What else did you love about it? She asked, and it was a natural question, the kind you ask when you are comfortable with someone, and the evening is quiet, and there is nowhere particular to be. He thought about it. The lamplight from inside cast a warm stripe across the porch boards, and somewhere down the street a horse was making a low, patient sound. The sense that it was possible to be a different kind of man than you've been raised to be, he said finally. That the land didn't know your history and didn't care about it. You had to prove yourself, but you got to decide what you were proving. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I think I understand that. He looked at her. You're far from home. I don't know that Sacramento felt very much like home by the end, she said. My father was the home, really, and then he was gone. She said it without self-pity, in the matter-of-fact way of a person who has processed a grief and arrived at the other side of it, not without scars but without the fresh bleeding. I think perhaps home is something you make rather than something you inherit. I think you're probably right about that, he said. The conversation ended there naturally, and she went inside and he stayed on the porch a while longer in the cold, and he thought that if he had been a different kind of man, a braver kind, or perhaps a more reckless kind, he might have said something else, something more. But he was not that kind of man, and so he sat with the silence and the stars and the feeling of something he could not quite afford to name, and eventually he went inside too. Christmas came to Calico Crossing with modest celebration. The church organized a supper to which the whole town was invited, and Theodora's students performed a short recitation that they had rehearsed for 2 weeks, and that went on the night extremely well. 2 of the children forgot their lines and recovered admirably. And the youngest, a girl named Bertie Birch, who was Harold's daughter and 7 years old, delivered her piece with such total conviction that people actually applauded, which caused Bertie to look first surprised and then enormously pleased with herself. Theodora stood at the back of the room watching and felt the kind of pride that she suspected was not entirely unlike what a parent feels, which surprised her, because she had not been in Calico Crossing long enough to have formed those kinds of attachments. Or so she would have said before that evening. Abel was there, as the whole town was. He stood on the other side of the room during the recitation, his hat in his hands, and she caught his eye across the crowd after Bertie finished, and he smiled. Not the polite half-smile of social courtesy, but a real one, warm and real, because he knew what the performance meant to her, and was glad for her sake that it had gone well. She smiled back, and then the moment passed because Mrs. Hensley was saying something to her, but the warmth of it stayed. After the supper, as people were clearing out into the cold night, Abel found her near the door and said, "That was a fine thing you did with those children." "They did it themselves," she said. "I just pointed them in the direction." "That's a larger part of it than you're giving yourself credit for," he said. She looked at him and almost said something that would have moved things forward. She could feel the shape of such a sentence forming somewhere in her chest, something about how she was glad she had stayed, how Calico Crossing had surprised her, how he in particular had, but she stopped herself, because she did not know what she would do with such a sentence once she had said it, and because she was not entirely sure what she meant by it. So she said, "Thank you, Abel," and they walked home in the cold along the empty street, and she told herself that was enough, that it was fine, that everything was exactly as it appeared to be. January brought a stretch of particularly cold weather that kept everyone indoors more than usual, and it was during this January that Calico Crossing's more complicated nature made itself apparent to Theodora in a direct way. She had known, in the general abstract way that a person knows about things they read in newspapers, that the West was not an uncomplicated place, that the land had not been empty before white settlement, that the people who had lived there before had not simply disappeared, and that the terms on which they had been displaced were not terms that bore close examination without producing a serious discomfort. She had known this. Knowing it in the abstract was different from seeing it. There was a man named Hector Reyes who ran a small horse trading operation on the outskirts of town. He was Mexican-born, had been in Nevada for 15 years, and spoke English with a fluency and precision that exceeded most of the people who made assumptions about him based on his name and his complexion. He was a decent man. Theodora had established this in the early weeks, because he was the uncle of one of her students, a boy named Tomás who was 11 and exceptionally quick at mathematics. Hector Reyes had come to the school once to speak with her about Tomás's progress, and they had talked for 20 minutes, and she had thought he was perceptive and serious and clearly invested in his nephew's education. In January, some men passing through town, 3 of them, rough-looking and not from anywhere around Calico Crossing, accused Hector Reyes of stealing 2 horses that, as far as anyone who actually knew anything could determine, were his own horses, purchased legally. The sheriff, a man named Archie Dodd, who was neither a bad man nor a particularly brave one, was uncertain what to do with the situation, and it began to look for a few hours as if things might go badly for Hector Reyes on the basis of nothing more than the accusations of 3 strangers and a set of assumptions that had nothing to do with evidence. It was Abel Walker who handled it, and Theodora watched from across the street as he did. He was calm and direct and did not raise his voice, but he spoke to the sheriff with a firmness that made it clear he was not interested in anything other than the actual facts. And he had the actual facts because he had traded with Hector Reyes on 2 occasions and knew the man's horses and his business dealings and his reputation. He laid it all out, one thing after another, until the situation was resolved without violence, and the 3 men were encouraged to continue on their way, which they did after some grumbling. Hector Reyes caught Abel's eye and gave him a nod that contained a great deal of what a man who has been in a dangerous position and been helped out of it has to express when he is too dignified to say it all aloud. Abel returned the nod with a simplicity that said he expected nothing from it. Theodora was still thinking about what she had seen an hour later when she encountered Abel coming out of the general store, and she said, without planning to, "What you did today was right." He looked at her and seemed to understand that she meant more than a simple compliment on a single act. "It was what any person should do," he said. "But not what every person does," she said. He accepted that with a nod, the same way he had accepted Hector's nod as a fact, not as praise. They walked together back toward the boarding house, and she found herself thinking that she knew exactly the quality of the man walking beside her, the way you know a piece of ground to be solid because you have tested it repeatedly, and it has never once given way under your weight. She trusted him, she realized. She trusted him completely, which was not something she could have said about many people in her life, and certainly not anyone she had known for only 4 months. She did not, still, understand what she was doing with that knowledge. February passed. The school term progressed. She wrote to her distant aunt in Millstone, who had turned out to be somewhat less interested in Theodora's well-being than her original letter had implied, and told her that she was well and that she planned to stay through the end of the school year and see what happened after that. The letter was true as far as it went, though she was aware that "see what happened after that" was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and that she was not being entirely honest with herself about what she was waiting to see. The thing she was not being honest with herself about was this: she wanted to stay. She wanted it with a specificity that surprised her, not just to stay in Calico Crossing abstractly, but to stay in this particular life that had assembled itself around her, with these children and this small room and Mrs. Hensley's relentlessly organized household and the morning breakfasts and the evening walks and Abel Walker reading old newspapers and pouring her coffee and saying things that she turned over in her mind for the rest of the day. She wanted that. She was not entirely sure what it meant that she wanted it, or what to do about the wanting, and she was constitutionally disinclined to act on feelings she had not fully examined, which meant she existed in a state of low-grade suspension that she was beginning to find exhausting. The thing that changed the situation, as is often the case, was not a grand gesture or a dramatic event, but something quite small and accidental. It was a Wednesday evening in late February, and Theodora had stayed late at the school working on lesson plans by lamplight. And when she finally walked back to the boarding house, the air was sharp, and the sky was full of stars, and the street was empty. She came around the corner of the church and found Abel Walker sitting on the church steps, not inside, just on the steps with his elbows on his knees and his hat pushed back on his head, and he looked like a man who had been sitting there long enough that the cold had gotten into him without his noticing. She stopped. "Abel, what are you doing out here?" He looked up. He seemed for just a moment like a man caught at something, not at anything wrong, but at something private. "Just thinking," he said. "It's very cold for thinking," she said. "Yes," he agreed, which made her smile despite herself. She should have gone inside. Instead, she sat down beside him on the church steps, close enough that the cold air between them was negligible, and she said, "Are you all right?" He was quiet for long enough that she understood the question had more weight than the circumstance might suggest. Then he said, "Gideon Pratt told me today he's selling the ranch. He's going to live with his daughter in Utah. He won't need my services past the spring." She took this in. "What will you do?" Another pause. "There's still an offer in Arizona," he said. "It's a good position. I should have taken it 6 months ago, honestly." Something in her chest made itself felt at this, something she could not have named precisely and could not have ignored. "Why didn't you?" she asked, and she was asking it the way she had asked about the West that evening in December, because it was a natural question when you were comfortable with someone, because you wanted to know the true answer. The silence this time was longer, and she became aware that his hands, which had been hanging loosely between his knees, had gone very still, the way a man goes still when he is deciding something. "I didn't go to Arizona," he said slowly, looking at the street rather than at her, "because I wasn't ready to leave." "What was keeping you?" she asked. He turned and looked at her then, and the lamplight from the distant window of the boarding house reached them just enough that she could see his face clearly, and what she saw there was something she had not seen there before, or perhaps something she had seen there and had not let herself read correctly. "You," he said, "you were keeping me." She did not speak. She was not capable of it for a moment. "You arrived on the stage that September afternoon," he said, "and I had a letter to Arizona that I was going to write the next morning, and I didn't write it, and I've been telling myself since then that I would figure out what to do about that." He stopped. "I haven't figured it out," he admitted, "but I didn't go, and now Gideon's selling and I'm going to have to figure it out pretty soon, so I thought I'd sit here in the cold and see if that helped." "Has it?" she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt, which she was grateful for. "No," he said, and the honesty of it was so complete and so unguarded that it made her want to reach for his hand. And so she did. She put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, and she felt him go very still again, a different kind of still this time. "I did not know," she said. "I truly did not know that you had stayed for any reason to do with me." "I know you didn't," he said. "I was not exactly forthcoming." "Why not?" He looked at her hand on his, and then he looked at her face, and she thought that for all of his steadiness and his quiet capability there was something very exposed about him in this moment, something that cost him something to show. "Because I didn't know what you wanted," he said. "Because I didn't want to presume, because it seemed more important to be someone you could trust than to push for something that might not be welcome." She understood then, all at once and very clearly, several things. She understood that he had been protecting her, not in the condescending way that protection sometimes means, but in the real way, the way that puts someone else's comfort and freedom above your own desire. She understood that the care she had been experiencing from him for months was not merely the care of a good neighbor or a polite boarding house companion, but something deliberate and considered and entirely specific to her. She understood that she had been holding something back in herself that was not, actually, ambiguous, that she had known, somewhere below the level of language, what she wanted, and that the not knowing had been a kind of cowardice she had dressed up as caution. "Abel," she said, "I have been in this town since September, and I have told myself at least a dozen times that I was only staying until the next thing, until the school term ended, until I figured out what came after. And every time I said it I knew it wasn't true. I just didn't know what the true thing was." She paused. "Now I think I might know." He was very still. "What is it?" he asked, and she could hear the effort it took to keep his voice even. "I think I am staying because of the same reason you stayed," she said. "Because the town isn't the reason. You're the reason." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she could not quite catalog, because it was too many things at once. Relief, she thought, and something that might have been joy, and something older than both of those. The way a man looks when something he has been careful not to hope for turns out to be true after all. He turned his hand under hers and held it properly, his fingers wrapping around hers, and said, "I would very much like to court you, Theodora, if you'll allow it." "I will allow it," she said, and she was smiling, and the cold did not feel particularly cold anymore. They sat on the church steps for another quarter of an hour in the Nevada night, not saying very much more. There would be time for more. And then they went inside, and Mrs. Hensley, who was still up and noticed things with remarkable acuity, took one look at both of them and said nothing whatsoever, just handed Theodora her lamp and went back to her knitting with an expression that was suspiciously close to satisfied. The courtship of Abel Walker and Theodora Aldridge was conducted in the way that courtships in Calico Crossing were conducted, in full view of a small town that had opinions about everything and expressed them freely, which meant that within approximately 2 days every person in Calico Crossing had been informed of the situation by someone, and most of them approved. Harold Birch at the general store told Abel that he was a sensible man. Hector Reyes, encountering Theodora at the water pump, said with great seriousness that Abel Walker was a man worth keeping, and she had agreed with equal seriousness. Mrs. Hensley, when finally asked directly by Theodora how she felt about the development, said that she had been expecting it since October and had been wondering how long it would take, which made Theodora laugh and then feel slightly embarrassed about how long it had taken. The courtship itself was not elaborate. It was walks and conversations, and the long evenings at the boarding house table where they talked about everything about books, and about the way the land worked, and about his years on the trail and her years in Sacramento, and what they had each learned, and what they each still wanted. It was the particular quality of being known by someone, which is different from being observed and different from being understood in the intellectual sense, and which produces in the person being known a feeling of extraordinary safety. He told her, over several evenings, about growing up in Texas, the father who had been hard to love and harder to live with, the mother who had made space for her children's inner lives, even when the outer ones were constrained by poverty and labor. The sister, Ellie, who was 22 now and had married a good man, and was expecting her first child in the spring. The cattle drives, which had been hard and beautiful and clarifying in the way that physical hardship can be clarifying when it is chosen, rather than simply endured. The slow accumulation of skill and reputation that had made him sought after as a horseman and ranch hand, and the way that skill had given him freedom without giving him purpose, which was a distinction he had learned to care about. She told him about her father, who had been gentle and bookish and not particularly suited to the practical management of money, and how she had loved him for the gentleness and the books, and had spent most of her adult life quietly managing the practical side of things herself, which had been good training for the present circumstances, even if it had been hard at the time. About her mother, who she could barely remember except in the way you remember a warmth, not the specific features of it but the quality of it, the way it felt to be near it. About the Women's Institute in Sacramento and the 2 years that had shaped the way she thought more than anything else in her education, and how she had been told repeatedly that wanting to be a teacher was a fine ambition, and also secretly thought she might want to do more than that, though she had not had the courage to say what more might look like. "What does more look like?" he asked her one evening, genuinely curious, and she thought about it and said that she thought it looked like building something. Not a business, not necessarily, but something, a life with actual structure and meaning in it, a contribution she could see the effect of. "I look at those children," she said, "and I think that is something real, something that lasts past me." "It is," he said. "Is that enough for you?" she asked, and she meant it genuinely, not as a test but as a question, because she wanted to know who she was telling these things to and whether the person she was telling them to was the person she thought he was. He considered her carefully. "I think the question of what's enough is one a person should get to answer for themselves," he said. "And I think you'll know when you're at it." He paused. "What I can tell you is that whatever it ends up being, I would like to be part of it, if you'll have me." She looked at him in the lamplight of the boarding house parlor and thought that she was going to say yes to that, to all of it, and that she was not afraid of saying yes, which was itself a remarkable thing, because she had been afraid of most of the large decisions of her life and had made them anyway, but not without fear. This one felt different. This one felt solid under her feet. March came in with a wind that battered the shutters and sent dust along the street in long brown curtains, and it brought with it the news that Gideon Pratt had found a buyer for his ranch. A family from Ohio named the Crenshaws, who were coming west in the spring with the particular combination of optimism and ignorance that often characterizes such endeavors, but who were, reportedly, genuinely hardworking people, so perhaps it would go well for them. Abel would be finished at the Pratt Ranch by the end of April. This was now a fact rather than a possibility, which meant that the question of what came next had to be addressed as a practical matter rather than a philosophical one. They addressed it on a Sunday afternoon in mid-March, walking out beyond the edge of town to where the land opened up into a wide flat stretch with a view of the mesas, which Theodora had taken to visiting when she wanted to think. Abel had come with her several times before, and they both found they could be quiet together comfortably, which she thought was one of the more important discoveries you could make about a person. "I've been thinking," he said, after they had walked in silence for a while. "I had supposed you might be," she said. "There's a piece of land," he said, "about a mile north of town toward the creek. I've noticed it a few times. It's not much to look at right now, but it's got water rights and decent soil and enough flat ground to build on." He paused. "I've been thinking about horses, not working for someone else's operation but my own, breeding and training. There's a market for it in this part of Nevada, and it would grow as the territory grows." She looked at him, because this was a new piece of what he was, a piece she had not seen before, the shape of his ambition, which matched the shape of his capability in a way that felt right. "You would need capital to start," she said, thinking practically. "I have savings," he said. "Not a great deal, but enough to start small and build. It would take several years to get it to a proper going concern." He glanced at her sideways. "I'm not saying it would be easy. I have never in my life wanted the easy version of things," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped too. He turned to face her fully and he said, "Theodora, I want to ask you something very specific." "All right," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, and his voice was steady but his hands were not. They moved slightly, as if he was restraining the impulse to reach for her. "I want to build that horse operation, and I want to build a house on that piece of land north of town, and I want to do those things with you beside me. I want to sit across from you at breakfast for the rest of my life. I want to know what you think about everything you haven't told me yet, which I estimate is a great deal." He looked at her directly, with the full force of those brown eyes that she had been underestimating since September. "I love you," he said, and it was the first time he had said it in those precise 3 words, and the simplicity of it was more powerful than any speech. "I have loved you since before I understood that was what it was." Yes. She stood in the Nevada afternoon light, with the wind moving around them and the mesas red in the distance. And she thought about everything, Sacramento, and the damp books, and the letter that had brought her here, and the 12 children and the morning coffee, and the cold church steps, and the way he had held her hand, and the way she had come to know the specific quality of his goodness, the way you know the quality of a material, by testing it carefully over time. She thought about the fact that she had told herself she was not going to stay, over and over again, and had stayed anyway, had stayed because somewhere below the level of the stories she told herself, she had already decided that this was where she was, and this was who she was staying for. "Yes," she said. "Abel Walker, the answer is yes, and it has probably been yes for longer than I am entirely comfortable admitting." He reached for her then, and she stepped into it, and he held her with the particular quality of a man who is not demonstrative by habit but who means everything he does, and she thought that this was what she had been building toward without knowing it, and that it was exactly right. They were married in May of 1883, in the small church with the crooked steeple, with the whole of Calico Crossing in attendance, which was not an enormous crowd, but felt like one because everyone was making considerable noise about it. The ceremony was conducted by the minister, a good-natured man named Reverend Poole who wore spectacles and had a habit of tearing up during weddings that he had apparently never been able to cure. Bertie Birch was allowed to carry a small bunch of wildflowers because she had asked with such complete sincerity that it was impossible to say no. Mrs. Hensley baked a cake with dried fruit and pronounced it her best work, and then immediately said she had done better but that this was a close second, which was a very Mrs. Hensley thing to say. Hector Reyes brought a bottle of very good wine that he had been saving for a significant occasion, and Harold Birch gave them a bolt of good cotton cloth as a wedding gift, and the sheriff, Archie Dodd, gave them a handshake and a slightly awkward speech about wishing them well that was entirely sincere if not particularly eloquent. Abel wore his best clothes, which Theodora had seen only once before and which had been acquired at some point in his past for occasions such as this. A dark coat and a clean white shirt and his good boots, and his hair had been very properly arranged, and he looked, she thought, standing at the front of the church waiting for her, like the man she was certain of in a world full of uncertainties. She wore a dress she had made from the cotton Harold Birch gave them, which was dark blue and had taken her 2 weeks in the evenings, and she walked down the aisle of the small church with no one to give her away because she had no family present, and she thought that was all right, that she was doing this herself as herself, which seemed fitting for who she was. They said the words to each other, and when Abel said the words to her, he said them looking at her with complete attention, and when she said them back, she meant every syllable of them with a specificity that surprised her, not because she had not expected to mean them, but because she had not expected the meaning to feel so specific, so particular to this one man and no other. Reverend Poole cried. Bertie Birch looked very serious about her flowers. Mrs. Hensley did not cry, but pressed her lips together in a way that suggested she was exercising considerable restraint. After, on the steps of the church in the May sunshine, with the whole town around them and the Nevada sky enormous and blue overhead, Theodora stood beside Abel Walker and felt, with a completeness she could not quite hold in one thought, that she was home. Not in the inherited sense, not the home of her father's boarding house or the city she had grown up in, but in the made sense, the one she had built herself, with a foundation she trusted because she had tested it, piece by piece, over the course of 9 months in a small town in the Nevada desert. Abel put his hand on her back, light and sure, and leaned down to say quietly into her ear, "I am very glad I did not write that letter to Arizona." She laughed, and she turned to look at him, and she said, "So am I, though you could have saved us both considerable time by telling me sooner." "I know it," he said. "Well," she said, "you can spend the rest of your life making it up to me." "That," he said, "is the most appealing plan anyone has ever put to me." The land north of town, toward the creek, turned out to be exactly what Abel had seen in it. They acquired it at the end of May, which was possible in part because Gideon Pratt had been generous in his final payment to Abel, and in part because Theodora had more savings than she had initially mentioned, from the careful management of the Sacramento boarding house in its final years that had not, in the end, saved the boarding house, but had given her a cushion she had been hoarding like a private fact about herself. They began to build. Not quickly building is not a quick business when you are doing a good portion of it yourselves with whatever help you can hire from town on weekends, but steadily. Abel was precise about the work, which Theodora found did not surprise her. He made plans and followed them, and when something did not work as planned he adjusted without complaint and without drama, just figured out the next approach and applied it. She helped where she could, which was more than he initially thought it would be because she had grown up practical and was not afraid of labor. And when she could not help physically, she managed everything else, the accounts, the correspondence with suppliers, the negotiations for the first horses he intended to breed. She continued teaching through the following school year. The children of Calico Crossing were, by this point, quite accustomed to her, and several of the older ones had made genuine progress that made her proud in a way that was difficult to articulate precisely. Tamaz Reyes, who was 12 now, had moved beyond anything the basic school could offer him in mathematics, and she had begun lending him books from her own collection, and setting him problems that stretched him, and she thought that if someone got him access to a proper education, he would do something remarkable with it. By the autumn of 1883 the house was livable, not finished, not the full thing Abel planned, but livable, with a proper kitchen and 2 rooms and a porch that faced the creek and got the best of the late afternoon light. They moved out of Mrs. Hensley's boarding house in October, and on their last morning at the breakfast table, Mrs. Hensley said, without looking up from her coffee, "You may come back for breakfast whenever you like. It will not be the same without you." Which was, from Mrs. Hensley, essentially a declaration of love. They did go back sometimes, not every day but often enough that the table felt familiar, and Mrs. Hensley's boarding house was replaced in their domestic life by their own kitchen table, which Abel had built from a solid piece of timber he had acquired from a tree that had come down in a summer storm, and which was large enough for 6 people, which was, he said when he made it, optimistic. In the spring of 1884, a letter arrived from Abel's sister Ellie in Texas. She wrote to tell them that she had had her baby, a boy, healthy and loud, who they had named James, and that she was well and that her husband was well, and that she would love very much to see her brother one day, and to meet the woman who had managed to convince him to stay in one place. Theodora wrote back and said that she was not sure convincing was precisely the right word, but that she took the point, and that she hoped very much that one day the distance would be crossable, and that she was glad the baby and Ellie were well. The horse operation began in earnest in 1884. Abel acquired 2 mares and a stallion that he had been watching for months, a dark roan that had the quality of bone and temperament he was looking for, and began the patient work of building a breeding program. He had a reputation in Calico Crossing and the surrounding ranches that preceded him, and word spread in the way that word of genuine quality always spreads in a small community, which is to say faster than expected and with less effort than one would assume. By the end of 1884, he had sold 3 horses and had inquiries from ranchers as far as 40 miles distant. Theodora managed the books and the correspondence and offered opinions about the horses with growing confidence. She had spent enough time around the operation by now that she had opinions worth offering, which Abel took seriously and sometimes acted on, because he was not a man who confused the source of good advice with the quality of it. She also continued to teach, because she was not ready to stop, and because the children still needed a teacher and she was still the best one available. In the summer of 1884, she discovered she was expecting a child. She told Abel in the kitchen of the house north of town, in the early morning before the work day had properly begun, sitting across the large timber table with 2 cups of coffee between them, and she said it in the direct way she said most important things. "I believe I am going to have a baby." He set down his cup and looked at her, and she watched the information move through him surprise first, because they had been hoping but had begun to wonder if it would happen, and then something that was not quite what she had expected, which was not joy exactly, not at first, but something more vulnerable and more complete than joy, something that looked like a man encountering a feeling he does not have the proper frame for and building one quickly, right there in front of her. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very all right," she said. He stood up and came around the table and took her face in his hands carefully, as if she were something precious, and she said, "I am not breakable," and he said, "I know you are not, Theodora, I have known that from the beginning," and he kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and she put her hands over his and they stayed like that in the morning kitchen for a long moment, with the light coming in through the window and the sound of the horses outside and the whole of their built life around them. Their son was born in February of 1885, in the house north of town, attended by the town's doctor, a capable and unflappable man named Dr. Sidney Marsh, who had been in Calico Crossing for longer than anyone seemed to know, and who handled the situation with the calm professionalism of a man who has brought many children into the world and has developed a settled confidence in the business of it. The labor was not easy. Theodora was not a woman who would have complained about difficulty, but this was the kind of difficulty that is difficult without argument. And when it was finished and Dr. Marsh placed the baby in her arms, she was exhausted down to the cellular level and felt, simultaneously, more awake than she had felt in months. The baby was red-faced and emphatic about existing, which she considered a good sign. Abel was allowed in immediately afterward, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and stood over her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, the totality of it, the way it contained every feeling at once and resolved them all into something very simple, which was love, the plain and complete and undecorated thing itself. "He is very loud," Abel said. "He comes by it honestly," Theodora said. You should hear yourself when the horses do something you've told them not to." He laughed, which caused the baby to pause and consider this new sound. And then the baby made a sound of his own that was not precisely a response, but felt like one. They named him William. After Theodora's father, William Henry Aldridge had been a man of considerable imperfection, but also of real love, and she wanted to give the name somewhere good to go. William Walker arrived in the world in February of 1885, and he was loud and red-faced, and entirely in earnest about everything from the first, which was perhaps inherited. Mrs. Hensley visited within 48 hours and brought food, and gave the baby a long appraising look, and said he had good proportions, which was her version of saying he was beautiful. Hector Reyes sent a note of congratulation with Tomás, who was 14 now, and had been assisting Abel with the horses on weekend mornings, and who looked at the baby with an expression of such careful scientific interest that Theodora nearly laughed. Harold Birch sent penny candy, which was of no use to a newborn, but the sentiment was correct. The years that followed 1885 and into 1886 and beyond were not without difficulty. The horse operation went through one summer where a disease moved through several of the ranches in the area and took 2 of their animals, which was a financial blow they absorbed with difficulty, but absorbed. There was a drought one year that made the creek run low and required conservation measures and hard decisions about the number of horses they could sustain. There were months when the money was tighter than comfortable, and months when it was not, and Theodora kept the books with a precision that meant she always knew exactly where they stood, which Abel found both reassuring and occasionally alarming. The school changed in these years. Calico Crossing grew, not enormously, not like the boom towns that the railroad could produce, but steadily, because the land was workable and the water rights were there, and people came looking for honest work and sometimes found it. New families arrived. New children appeared in Theodora's schoolroom. She eventually petitioned the town council for a proper building, not the back room of the church, which was drafty and inadequate, and got it, because by this point she had been in Calico Crossing long enough to know exactly how to make a case that would land, and because Abel Walker sat on the town council by 1886, which was a development that had surprised him and not surprised Theodora at all. Because people had been taking his opinion seriously for years, and it was only a formal acknowledgement of what was already true. The school building went up in 1886 and had 2 rooms and proper windows and enough chalk to last through several terms, and on the day it opened, Theodora stood in front of it with William on her hip. He was a year old and had Abel's dark eyes and her insistence about everything, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing built and finished and real. Tomás Reyes, by 1886, had outgrown what she could teach him in mathematics and natural sciences, and she had spent considerable effort writing to institutions and making inquiries on his behalf. There was a college in San Francisco that had begun accepting students of broader backgrounds, and there was a possibility, not certain, but real, of a scholarship if the application was handled correctly. She handled it. Hector Reyes, when informed of the effort she had been making, was quiet for a moment and then said, in a voice that was carefully controlled, "Miss Theodora, Mrs. Walker, I do not have words adequate for this." "You don't need words," she said. "We just need Tomás to write a very good letter, which I know he can do." Tomás was accepted. He left Calico Crossing in the autumn of 1887 on the stage that Theodora had arrived on 5 years earlier, carrying a bag that was considerably better packed than her trunks had been, and Hector Reyes stood on the street and watched the stage go with an expression of pride so pure it was nearly unbearable to look at directly. Abel had another child in mind. He had mentioned it once or twice with the careful indirectness of a man who has an opinion but is not going to push it, and Theodora had said, with equal care, that she was not opposed, but that she needed the current child to be a little more capable of independent locomotion before she was ready to begin the process again, which she considered a reasonable position. Abel had agreed immediately, which was one of the 10,000 reasons she loved him. Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1888, and they named her Clara Mee Walker. She arrived with less dramatics than William had managed, and with a contemplative quality that suggested she was already taking notes on her surroundings, which made her parents exchange a glance over her head on the first day that contained a full conversation without a single word being spoken. William, who was 3, received his sister with a mixture of fascination and wariness that resolved itself over the following weeks into a proprietary protectiveness. He was not sure about her, but he was very sure she was his, which Theodora thought was probably the correct attitude in the end. By 1888, the horse operation was established in the genuine sense. Abel had 6 horses of his own breeding, 2 of which had gone to ranches far enough away that their quality had traveled with them as reputation. He had a hand who worked for him 3 days a week, a young man named Pete Sandoval, who was learning the trade with the seriousness it deserved. The house north of town had been added to twice. There was now a proper parlor and a 3rd bedroom, and a barn that was tight against the winter winds, and a garden that Theodora maintained with what Abel privately considered unreasonable dedication, but would never have said aloud. The letters from Ellie in Texas came regularly now, full of news about James, who was 4 in 1888 and apparently as loud and energetic as William, and about her life in the hill country, and about their mother, who was aging but well and who had expressed through Ellie a wish to see her son's wife and the grandchildren she had not yet met. Theodora had been writing to Abel's mother directly since their marriage, because it seemed right, and she suspected that the warmth of those letters had done something to bridge the distance in a way that was not nothing. In the fall of 1888, Abel's mother and sister came to Calico Crossing. They came by train to Reno. The railroad had, as Abel had predicted, eventually arrived in the region, and then by stage to Calico Crossing, and when the stage pulled in, Abel was there with the wagon to meet them, and Theodora was beside him with William holding one hand and Clara on her hip. Abel's mother, Margaret Walker, was 62 years old and smaller than Theodora had imagined, with white hair and eyes that were the same brown as Abel's and the same quality of seeing everything. She climbed down from the stage with assistance and then stood on the Calico Crossing street and looked at her son for a long moment without speaking, and Abel looked at her, and then she put her arms around him with a strength that was surprising for a small woman, and he held her with a gentleness that was very like him. Then she turned to Theodora. She looked at her carefully with those direct brown eyes, and then she held out both hands, and Theodora took them, and Margaret Walker said, "He wrote to me about you. He wrote more about you in one letter than he had written about himself in 10 years. I knew then." "Knew what?" Theodora asked. "That he'd finally found the reason," Margaret said simply, and squeezed her hands, and that was all that needed to be said on that subject. Ellie was 28 and bright and quick, and reminded Theodora so strongly of the sister she had never had that it was almost startling. They talked for 3 days almost continuously, with an ease and a depth that suggested some friendships do not require long building, but arrive already formed, as if the two people have simply been waiting in different locations for the geography to cooperate. Ellie adored William and Clara with an abandon that was completely mutual, and James, who had come with her, decided on the first afternoon that Abel was the best person he had ever met because Abel let him sit on a horse, which was all the credential a 4-year-old required. They stayed for 2 weeks, and when they left, Margaret Walker held Theodora's hands again on the Calico Crossing street and said, "Take care of him, though I see you already do." "He takes care of me," Theodora said. "We manage it together," Margaret smiled. "That is better," she said. The winter of 1888 into 1889 was a settled one, in the way that winters are settled when the life that contains them is solid. The school was full. The horse operation was running well. The house north of town was warm against the cold nights, and in the evenings Abel would sometimes sit by the fire reading while Theodora wrote at the table letters, lesson plans, the account books, and William would fall asleep on the rug beside Abel's chair and Clara would be asleep in her room. And the sounds of the house at night were the sounds of a place that was genuinely inhabited by people who wanted to be there. On one such evening, Abel looked up from his reading and watched Theodora for a moment without her noticing, the way you watch someone when you have the luxury of watching without them knowing, the way you look at a thing you love when it is simply being itself. He thought about the September afternoon in 1882 when he had looked up from the livery stable and seen her step off the stage. He thought about the letter to Arizona that he had never written. He thought about all of it, the church steps and the cold night and her hand over his and the wedding in May and the baby in the kitchen and the years of built things, built slowly and solidly and well. He was, he thought, the luckiest kind of man, not the kind who is given everything, but the kind who recognizes what he has in time to appreciate it. He went back to his reading, and after a while Theodora looked up and found him looking and said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "You were looking at me in a particular way," she said. "I was thinking," he said. "What were you thinking?" He set the book down and considered how to say it, and then he said the simple true thing, as he had learned to do. "I was thinking that I am glad I didn't write that letter. I was thinking about all the things I would have missed if I had. And I was thinking that I don't know how to say all of that properly, but that you should know it." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight of the house they had built, with the fire and the sleeping child and the Nevada night outside, and she said, "I know it, Abel." "Good," he said. "I feel it too," she said. "All of it." He smiled, and she smiled back, and that was the kind of conversation that does not need more words added to it, so neither of them added any. She went back to her accounts, and he went back to his book, and the fire burned down slowly, and William made a small sound in his sleep and then was quiet again. And outside the desert sky was full of stars the way it always was on clear winter nights in Nevada, enormous and cold and full of distance. And inside the house north of town everything was warm and particular and entirely, undeniably their own. In 1889, Theodora made a decision she had been approaching for several years. She proposed to the Calico Crossing Town Council that the school expand, that a second teacher be hired, one who could take the younger children while she worked with the older ones, and that the curriculum be formalized in a way that would allow the children of Calico Crossing to continue their education past the basic level that most small-town schools offered. She had been writing to schools in San Francisco and to the Nevada Territorial Education Authorities for 2 years, and she had materials and a plan, and the specific quality of determination that she applied to things she had decided mattered. Abel, who was still on the council, said nothing during the proposal that would suggest he was anything other than a neutral party evaluating a civic matter on its merits. He also voted yes with a promptness that caused at least one other council member to give him a sideways look, which he ignored. The expanded school opened in the fall of 1889 with a second teacher, a young woman named Frances Good, fresh from a teacher's college in San Francisco, who was nervous and capable, and whom Theodora took under her wing with the brisk practicality of someone who has been trained by experience rather than institution, and knows the value of both. By this point, Calico Crossing had grown enough to sustain the expansion. The railroad that Abel had predicted in 1882 had arrived in the broader region, and while the main line did not pass through Calico Crossing directly, a spur had been proposed, and there was every reason to believe it would eventually arrive. An anticipation of it had brought enough new residents to tip the town toward something more permanent. It felt, in 1889, like a place that was going to stay on the map, and that was not something that could be said of all the small western towns of the era. The following years were busy in the way of a life that is fully inhabited. William grew into a serious-faced boy who had his mother's love of books and his father's patience with physical work, and who by the age of 7 was helping in the barn, with a competence that made Pete Sandoval shake his head in the way of a man who is seeing his own job eventually being absorbed. Clara grew into something quite different, quick and sociable and intensely interested in everyone around her, with the quality of a person who will either be very charming or very exhausting depending on the day, and who was usually both. They had a third child in 1891, another boy, named Henry for Theodora's father's middle name, which was her compromise with herself on the subject of honoring the past. Henry arrived with considerably less fanfare than his predecessors, because by this point both parents had a level of experience with the process that allowed for a certain practical calm, and Henry himself seemed to sense this and cooperated accordingly, arriving efficiently and then settling into the household as if he had been there all along. Mrs. Hensley came to see Henry as she had come to see the other two, with food and assessment, and she declared him well-proportioned, and then said, entirely out of character, that she thought Theodora was one of the finest women she had ever known, which Theodora thanked her for with a sincerity that was total. The horse operation by 1891 was a genuine business. Abel had a full-time hand in Pete Sandoval, and a reputation that had spread to ranches in Utah and Arizona, which he had not gone to all those years ago, and from which customers now came to him, which he noted once to Theodora with a quiet irony that she appreciated. He had a small building near the barn that functioned as an office, where he kept his records and conducted his business correspondence with the neat, precise handwriting that he had taught himself from a book when he was 18 and had practiced ever since. Theodora ran the school in the mornings and came home in the afternoons to the house and the 3 children and the life that she had made, and she thought sometimes about the stagecoach that had brought her here 9 years ago, and the woman she had been on it, tired and uncertain and determined and alone. And she felt for that woman a great tenderness and a great gratitude, because that woman had gotten off the stage in the right place and had been stubborn enough to stay in it long enough to understand why. She thought about what Abel had said to her on the church steps that February night in 1883. "You were keeping me." She had not known it. She had truly not known it, and when she had found out she had stayed too, not because of the revelation itself, but because the revelation had finally given her permission to name what she already knew, which was that Calico Crossing was home, and Abel Walker was home, and she did not want to be anywhere else. In the evenings, when the children were settled and the house was quiet, they sat together as they had sat on the boarding-house porch in those early months, she with her tea, he with his coffee, and they talked or they did not talk, and both were equally good. He still read things aloud from the newspaper sometimes, not to anyone in particular, just into the air of the room, and she still listened before she consciously decided to. And she thought that some qualities in a person are not something they learn or decide on, but simply something they are, and that knowing those qualities in the person you have chosen is one of the great gifts available to a human life. The crooked steeple on the church was straightened in 1892, which the whole town treated as a significant event, though Theodora was mildly sorry to see it go, because it had been the first thing she had noticed about Calico Crossing when the stage pulled in, and she had always thought of it with a kind of affection. The Crenshaw family, who had bought Gideon Pratt's ranch, turned out to be genuinely hardworking people, as had been hoped. They became neighbors in the broader sense, the kind of people you knew and trusted and occasionally needed and occasionally helped. And their oldest boy was one of Theodora's students in the early years, and one of the better ones. Gideon Pratt sent a letter from Utah once, asking after the ranch and after Abel, and Abel wrote back with news that was thoroughly positive, which it could be honestly, and Gideon's reply expressed the satisfaction of a man who has left something in good hands. Hector Reyes's horse trading operation grew in the same years that Abel's operation grew, and they were each other's nearest competition and best professional relationship simultaneously, which was the way of things between people who respect each other's competence and do not need to diminish it to feel secure in their own. Tomás Reyes from San Francisco wrote letters to his uncle and occasionally to Theodora, and his letters were increasingly extraordinary, precise and confident, and full of ideas, the letters of a young man who has found his footing in the world and is moving fast in it. He wrote to her in 1890 to tell her he had won a prize in applied mathematics, and she had shown the letter to Abel with a pride that she thought might actually be the largest thing she had felt in some time. Abel read it and said, "That's your doing." "It's his doing," she said. "It started with you," Abel said, which was as much credit as Theodora was ever going to comfortably take, but which was also the truth, and she knew it. The century moved toward its end with the particular momentum of a time that is changing faster than its inhabitants can always keep up with. The railroad came closer. The territory of Nevada was already a state, had been since 1864, though it felt, in the eastern portions, like statehood was still arriving in pieces. The world beyond the desert was moving quickly, and what had been the Wild West of the dime novels was giving way to something more settled and more complicated, and the people who had lived it knew the difference between the version they had lived and the version that would eventually be written, and most of them had the wisdom to say very little about it. Abel Walker, on the porch of the house north of town one evening in 1892, watching the last of the daylight leave the sky, said to Theodora, "Do you think you would have believed when you came here that this was what it would become?" She thought about it honestly, which she always did. "No," she said. "I don't think I would have believed in any of it. The town, the school, the house." She paused. "You," she looked at him sideways, "especially you." "Why especially me?" he asked. "Because you were already here when I arrived," she said, "and things that are already in place are easy to overlook until they aren't." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent a fair amount of time hoping you wouldn't overlook me," he said. "I know," she said. "You were very patient about it." "I had considerable motivation," he said. She laughed, and he smiled, and the evening settled around them with the ease of 9 years of evenings that had preceded it, and the stars came out one by one in the enormous Nevada sky, and the horses in the barn made the low, patient sounds that horses make. And from inside the house came the sound of William and Clara conducting what sounded like a significant disagreement about something. And Henry, who was a year old and entirely unbothered by everything, made no sound at all because he was asleep. Theodora reached over and took Abel's hand where it rested on the porch railing, and he turned his hand and held hers the way he had held it the first time, on the church steps, in the cold. "Abel," she said. "Yes. I am glad you stayed," she said. "I am glad every day that you stayed." He looked at her with those brown eyes that she knew as well as she knew her own thinking and said, "I am glad you found out why." "So am I," she said, "though you were very slow in telling me." "I was," he agreed. "It all worked out," she said. "It did," he said, and he said it with the particular conviction of a man who knows, precisely and specifically, how true the thing he is saying is, who has counted the cost and the grace and the luck and the choice, who has built the life and lived in it long enough to know its weight and its warmth, and who has nothing left to prove about it because the proof is all around him, in the house and the children and the horses and the woman beside him, and the sky above that has always been, in the end, the thing that makes the West worth anything at all. They stayed on the porch a while longer in the way of people who know they have time and are not in a hurry to use it up, and the night came in full around them, and the stars did what they always did in the Nevada desert, which was to be everything. Inside, Clara and William had resolved their disagreement, or abandoned it, which in children amounts to the same thing. Henry slept. The lamp burned on the table. The house north of town in Calico Crossing held, in every room and every beam of it, the life that two people had built from a late afternoon stage arrival, and an unwritten letter, and a cold night on some church steps, and the plain, brave act of saying the true thing when the time finally came for saying it. That was the story of it, and the story was not finished. It went on into more years and more seasons, more students and more horses and more children who grew and went out into the world carrying something of what had been taught to them in the small schoolroom with the good windows, more evenings on the porch and more mornings at the table, and more conversations that mattered and some that did not but were good too. But if you had to find the center of it, the still point around which all the rest revolved, it would be that February evening in 1883 when Theodora Aldridge sat down on the church steps beside Abel Walker and put her hand over his in the cold and found out, for the first time and once and for all, why he had stayed. And when she found out, she stayed too, and that made all the difference and went on making it, year after year, in the town they had chosen and the life they had built and the love that had been true before either of them had the words for it. Which is, in the end, how the best loves always go.